Your kid is gifted. How can they have challenges? They are smart. Being gifted doesn't mean you have it easy. If you're gifted and you have ADHD or autism or any learning difficulty, then you have a 2E child, or you're a 2E person, twice exceptional. I don't know much about it except for the experience I have with my own daughter and me with my living experience. So I brought back Dr. Norrine Russell, founder of Russell Coaching Students for Complex Students who are 2E, twice exceptional, ADHD, autism, or anxiety. She is the author Asking the Right Questions Before, During, and After Your Child's ADHD Diagnosis. She has a Ph.D. with focus on psychology and education, with 20 plus years of experience with youth and parent development. Dr. Russell, welcome back.
I'm thrilled to be here. And this is an extremely important topic. There are so many misconceptions about people with high IQ, and they're all like this or they're all like that. And so I'm really excited to be with you and talking about this and delving into it, and especially looking at the connection to ADHD and autism.
Yeah, so to start off, can you please define the term twice exceptional, or 2E, as we're probably going to reference it? And first of all, I think we need to define the term gifted in the academic sense.
Yeah. So when you hear someone say gifted and they're a psychologist or psychiatrist or educator, what they mean is someone who falls in the top 1 to 2 percentile of intellectual functioning. And generally, what we're talking about there is reasoning, problem-solving ability. And so the term gifted is the word that has been used to describe people with that exceptionally high level of IQ, okay? Mm-hmm. Now, the word gifted can mean all kinds of other things, but that's the word that is used in this field to describe people who are of exceptionally high IQ, in the top 1 to 2 percentile. So their IQ is higher than 98 to 99% of people in the world.
Okay. So it's a lot to do with how the brain and your brain's processing abilities in certain areas of a thing. So gifted kids, they can be highly intellectual in certain aspects of like math, science, art, and all that. But that doesn't mean they're intellectually high percentile in all aspects of intellectual thinking, correct?
Correct. And this is something where I think with a little more discussion, we can get a little clearer, right? I want to say everyone has gifts, right? Mm-hmm. So if we can differentiate between gifts that people have versus being gifted in a technical sense, I think that's helpful, right?
Correct.
So my son has a gift for reading. He, since kindergarten, first grade, has been reading at the college level. That is a gift that he has of verbal ability. Does his IQ overall reach the gifted level? No, but he has a gift for reading. And we see gifts in everyone, right? Some people have a gift for math. Some people have a gift for dance or for sports or creativity, right? All those things are extremely valuable. The difference is, do they have gifts or are they gifted? Mm-hmm. And we also want to talk about the relationship of when you're 2E, being gifted intellectually and having ADHD or autism or a learning difference.
Okay, but that's ultimately we want to get into twice exceptional, but there's one more point I'd like to discuss more about the gifted side, especially with children. From what I read and understood when my daughter was identified gifted in school, is their intellectual growth exceeds and is above their, let's just use them. They're 13 years old. Their intellectual processing is actually more, maybe 17, 18-year-old processing, but their emotional growth is at their 13 year, at that age, at the proper age. And that difference, the brain knowing that the intellect is a little more advanced while the emotional is behind, and that gap is where they have challenges dealing with that difference, and that gets misunderstood. And then the emotions take control because it doesn't know what to do. Is that a correct assessment?
I think it's such an important piece for parents to be aware of, because sometimes our tendency is to think, oh, they're so bright, they're so smart. And sometimes too, they can seem so very mature, right? But that doesn't mean that socially and emotionally they are any more developed than their peers. And so you might have, for example, a 9-year-old who's ready for algebra and geometry, but out on the playground still wants, to interact with the other 9-year-olds and play games, and might get upset when they lose, might get upset when they get teased, right? And so we have to be able to recognize that the gifted piece is an intellectual piece, but it doesn't mean that the child is advanced in terms of their social and emotional skills. And it's easy when they are so incredibly verbal and their vocabulary is out of this world, and they're getting A's, or they're getting placed in, advanced classes, or they're even getting, skipped ahead, or they're taking college classes, right? Somehow in our brains, as adults, as parents or teachers, we start to think, oh, this is a young adult, or this is an adult. No, this is still a child.
Right.
Whose brain is in some ways behaving like an adult, but they still need the same social and emotional development time that every other 9 or 13 or 16-year-old needs, right? And I see this as a pattern of frustration sometimes with parents, like, they're so smart, why can't they make better choices? They're still going through the process of development, of cognitive development, moral development. Simply being intellectually gifted doesn't mean that you're mature.
Right. And I like that term you're using, maturity. Like the intellect, the proper, I should have said, is the intellectual maturity is more advanced than the emotional maturity of a child. And I like how you brought in even the moral development is that you get a moral maturity as well. And as a kid, you just don't have that. That really comes down to who you're surrounded by, the environment, how you're raised, the circle of friends. And that's the other thing too. I think the listeners got the key point that Norrine made is, as parents or even adults, just because someone is intellectual, we make that assumption they must be able to figure out the emotional side of themselves. And everyone matures at different rates, especially children. And that was the biggest thing I saw with my daughter, was like, I can now see the emotional reaction she was having had nothing to do with us. It was more, I think it was more of a battle between the intellectual brain and the emotional brain, and not quite understanding why. And that frustrates someone, especially someone who's quite intellectual or thinks a lot, is, if I can't figure it out, it pisses me off.
Right. And so we have to have this idea, right? We have to be reminded of this. You have a, whatever it is, 6-year-old, 8-year-old, 10-year-old who is gifted intellectually, but still needs parenting for the other aspects of their development, right? Just like you were talking about, social development, emotional development, moral development, physical development, right? And so if we simply say to ourselves, this child has the intellectual capacity, but they are still a child, then I think it helps us reframe the need to
make assumptions.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And why am I bringing up the emotional side, the emotional disparity? Is that the right word? I don't know, I'll figure that out later. Disparity, that's the word. Because now with the ADHD brain, it's been well researched and identified that children with ADHD brains, their emotional maturity is actually lagging 2 to 3 years, or a third of the age. So now that just widens that emotional maturity gap.
Yes.
And parents make misunderstandings that their kid is just a bad kid. They can't behave. But we got that emotional stuff. And now we add on the gifted brain to have that challenge. It just amplifies it. And this is why I want to talk about the 2E child.
Mhm.
So what else challenges and gifts does a 2E brain child have? And let's just stick to the concept of, we'll just stick to two, because it could be 3E, 4E as well, but let's just stick to the main theme is the ADHD and the gifted brain in this case.
Yeah. Yeah. I think this is something that, I mean, in my experience, drives parents crazy, right? Because you have this kid who is so bright, so academically gifted. And then you have the ADHD part, and they can be hyperactive, they can be impulsive, they can have trouble getting their work done. And parents get fixated on, but they're so smart. Why don't they make better decisions? They're so smart. Why can't they get their homework done? They're so smart. Why can't they behave better in class? Right.
Yeah.
And so what we have to realize is exactly what you've said, that with ADHD often comes a delay in the social and the emotional development. So now we have an even greater gap, right, between the intellectual functioning and the social, emotional, personal development. And for parents, I think that's super frustrating because it's easy to assume my kid is smart, they should be making better decisions. Well, decision making is a skill that grows over time, right? The ability to work hard, the ability to prioritize, these executive functioning skills are not at the 25 or 30-year-old level that the intellect can be at, right? And so sure, you've got a powerful brain. It can pick up a physics book. It can pick up a calculus book. I'm just throwing those things out as examples, and still not figure out how to put the homework in the backpack, or how to brush their teeth or how to keep their room organized. It's because there's more there, right? There is executive functioning skills, which are still developing in any child and young adult. And then there's the social and the emotional piece. But the gap that is greater in the 2E kid, I think, creates more confusion and more frustration on the part of parents. And then, one of the things that I think can happen is that child then gets a lot of messages that you should have been able to do this. You're so smart. Why couldn't you do this? You're so bright. Why aren't you, doing
So you're
better?
so smart, but yet you're stupid is what they're getting.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I know as a child, I remember being told, you're book smart with no common sense. And I was like, and to this day, that still kind of haunts me, if you will. It wasn't that I didn't have any common sense. It was that I had the common sense of a typical 7-year-old or 9-year-old or 11-year-old. I just didn't have the common sense of a 45-year-old, which is, where my brain was operating.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
I can relate to that.
I was chronologically 7 or 9 or 11. So I don't know who was expecting me to have the common sense of a mature adult, but of course I didn't. I was a child who could read really well and had great math skills.
Yeah. And it's funny how, and I'm guilty of this too, making that assumption just because someone's intellectually gifted or has that intellect to make these logical and academic decisions or processing the information. I like to think, to me, gifted is more about how your brain is processing information versus knowing more. That's how I explain it to my kids. And we say, well, since they can do that, therefore they can figure out their emotions. Well, man, like even adults can't figure out their emotions, and we're making that assumption because they sound smart and intellectual that they can figure it out. And as much as it's confusing for me as the parent, just imagine, how about we think about what the kid, it's confusing to them too, that they can't figure this stuff out. So it's not just one side here. So we're amplifying that challenge to our children as well.
Absolutely, we are. Absolutely, we are. And so creating space and conversation and normalizing the fact that, yeah, you have really great abstract reasoning skills. You have great math skills. You have great verbal skills. Your ability to solve problems is greater than what we would expect at your age. But yeah, it's okay to still be a kid. It's okay to still enjoy playing with toys. It's okay to still enjoy doing Legos or drawing. Like, your whole self is not your brain, but I think it is really easy for both educators and family members to fall into, oh, the smart kid is also the kid we expect to be mature, reasonable, a leader. Well, maybe we can unpack that a little bit and differentiate those things. Your smart kid has got great reasoning skills, good problem solving. They might be particularly talented in math or verbal skills, but they're still a kid and they deserve the opportunity to grow up with support and help with executive functioning skills, social and emotional skills. I mean, how many times do we see kids who are really bright, but they have a hard time relating to their peers, right?
Yeah.
Well, let's give those kids a little bit of support,
Let them play.
Let them play. Encourage them to play.
Yeah. How can you give us a few examples how this challenge of the 2E brain manifests in kids' behaviors?
Yeah. So there are a lot of ideas that float around out there that, the thinking is a little sloppy. And I think it's just because we overgeneralize, right? Like, oh, gifted kids can be like this. Gifted kids can be spacey. Gifted kids can be disorganized. Gifted kids can be rude. Gifted kids can, not have any sense of humor. I think we need to stop and really articulate that within the population of kids who are gifted, you're going to have all different kinds of personalities and interests and hobbies and habits, right? So I really am not sure that there is evidence for the idea that all gifted kids are like this, right? Now, we do know that gifted kids with ADHD are going to have those core symptoms of ADHD, right? Their brain isn't going to automatically regulate attention. They're going to have impulsivity, and sometimes they're going to have hyperactivity. Those things can coexist with their high IQ, but they're not necessarily manifestations of the high IQ. Like, they're symptoms of the ADHD, right? And so when people talk about kids who are gifted and they talk about, oh, they're high energy, they tend to only, be interested in the topics that are their deep interest. Sometimes I want to go a little deeper and say, is that gifted child perhaps 2E? Is what you're responding to the fact that they have ADHD or, and this is a topic for another day, have autism, right? And there's some differentiation that's useful between a kid who is otherwise neurotypical, but has a gifted IQ, an IQ of 130 or above, versus a 2E kid. But we can't make gross generalizations about what gifted people are like, because there is a very wide spectrum. And we have to be careful in our scientific thinking before we ascribe the symptoms of ADHD as being part of being gifted.
Can you elaborate on that last little part a bit more?
Sure. So sometimes people will say, oh, gifted people are like this. They're high energy, they're driven, they're creative, they only are interested in the things they're interested in. In actuality, that is not true for all gifted people.
Correct. I've seen the opposite.
Right. And so there are qualities of ADHD or autism that get ascribed to gifted kids, but
Oh,
that are
gotcha.
really part of their ADHD or their autism, right? Like, oh, that kid's so bright, but all he wants to do is learn about rockets. All gifted kids have a thing they're interested in, and they don't really want to learn about everything else at school.
Right.
Well, it's not necessarily true. Some people who are gifted don't have a special deep interest. And, some people who are gifted do have the ability to focus on things that they're not interested in. As someone who grew up gifted without ADHD, I could kind of direct my interest toward whatever class I was in. And that was really nice, right? Because I was able to be focused in language arts, in history, in science, in art, and music. And so my comment here is simply to make sure that we are differentiating what we're calling giftedness and what are ADHD symptoms, because a gifted kid can be low energy. A gifted kid can be high energy. A gifted kid can have particular interests. A gifted kid can have curiosity across the board. And so what I think is important for parents listening here is to just take a deeper look at their kid and see, of the behaviors that you're seeing, right? Which of those things are ADHD and which of those things are giftedness?
That makes a lot of sense. Yep.
Let me give you an analogy. A lot of parents who have kids with ADHD will say, "Oh, I just love their personality. They're so fun. They're so social. They have, lots of friends. They're just, enjoyable to be around." And as that child gets older, sometimes those qualities turn into impulsivity, right?
Yep.
And so I'll have a conversation with the parents to say, your child's personality is the same, right? But make sure you're differentiating hyperactivity and impulsivity from personality, right? If what you're seeing in your kid is, oh my gosh, they're so much fun because they always have so much energy and they're the first ones to jump in the pool and they're the first one with their skis on and they're the first one with the, basketball out on the court and they're wild and energetic and, always talking. There are times that that's fun, right? But is that also at times hyperactivity and impulsivity, right? And so my thought here is, when it comes to understanding how is giftedness manifesting in your child, understand what is the impact of ADHD and what is the impact of the giftedness. And don't assume that the ADHD things are the gifted things.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And from what I heard or what I did not hear is mainly it's this emotional maturity versus the intellectual maturity is probably the main gifted challenge. And if we want to put in the ADHD side, which our emotions are intensely, we got more feeling, like if we feel emotions more intensely, that can amplify it there too. But I really like how you said they're often misunderstood or mislabeled is probably another statement too. Yes. So my last question to you is there any differences between a 2E kid and a 2E adult? Because I'm sure we don't grow out of this.
Right. Excellent question. I think that some of what can be different relates to the point you've just made. Our 2E kids can feel their emotions so much more intensely, right? And because sometimes the social and emotional development is delayed, sometimes we can see, a lot of outbursts or emotional dysregulation or, rejection sensitivity because you have that intensity of the emotions from the ADHD. And even though you're bright, doesn't necessarily mean that you know how to process all of that, right? And so I think one difference that you can see with someone who's matured is that the difference between the child who's 2E and the adult who's 2E is that the adult sometimes has better coping, better regulation, right? They've learned how to tame the ADHD and how to work with the ADHD, whereas certainly in the years of puberty and young adult, the ADHD can be more in control. Where we get to the 2E adult who has learned how to understand their ADHD and how to manage their ADHD, then I think the intellect can be a little bit more in control.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And for me is because I found out later in life that I was identified as gifted as a child, but I just was never put in the right programs for that. Um, I'm understanding where my intellectual abilities are stronger in certain areas and the other ones I'm very lacking. And I'm trying not to stay in those lower lacking intellectual areas or processing areas. And for everyone to say, like, for your kids, this is what I used the term with my daughter, and it made a big impact on her. Says you're identified as gifted. It just means you process information differently and faster than most. Doesn't mean you're smarter. Doesn't mean you're better than anyone. It's just your brain's working differently. And then throwing in the ADHD side, which for her, it's going 200 miles an hour all the time. You can see a physical difference there too. So, like you said earlier, Norrine, the intellectual maturity is different than emotional maturity and social maturity for kids. And even the moral development is key. And as kids, they don't have the emotional maturity and moral maturity at that time, even though their intellect is a little more advanced. And that's where us as parents, we misunderstand that. And like you said, just because you're bright doesn't mean you know how to regulate and work through the emotions. And for me, I'm seeing that intellect and behavior are not a linear relation. You can't say just because you're intellectual or smart, you can figure out your behaviors. They're not correlated directly. So there's a bit of what do you call that? I'm thinking of the French word. I can't equation. That's it. Just like you said, you're accused of being book smart with no common sense. In a way, that is a compliment. In a way, they recognize that you don't have the common sense of a higher intellectual age, but at the same time, it's a backhanded compliment. And kids misunderstand that very easily, even though it was well-intentioned.
Yeah.
Possibly. Yeah. And the last thing, yeah.
I think it was intended as a compliment. But what I heard was you were lacking,
Yeah.
But yeah, I interrupted you. Go ahead. Yeah.
No. And then I want to bring that up again because yes, just because you're so smart, you should figure this out. You're basically telling your kid that you're so smart, you're stupid.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of messaging is very confusing to the emotional maturity of a child. The kid is 15. They have the emotional maturity of a 15-year-old, even though the intellect could be 20, 25. And we got to get over this assumption that just because you're smart, you can figure everything out. And the last point I have is ADHD and gifted traits and challenges can be misunderstood by everyone. And like you said, Norrine, we really got to play those out to work them out to make sure it's a gifted thing or if it's an ADHD thing. And then to deal with that behavior accordingly. And I think there'll be a lot less confusion in there. So I would love this to be another 2 hours, but we got a timeline. So where can people find you, Norrine?
So Russell Coaching for Students can be found at russellcoaching.com. And once you go there, you can find us on all the socials, Instagram, YouTube, etc. And what we do at Russell Coaching for Students is we help students who have been identified as neurodiverse in some way. They have ADHD, autism, giftedness, learning differences, and we help them with executive functioning skills and academic skills and life skills. And so in some ways, really, what we do is exactly what we've been talking about today, is to create a safe space for kids who are a little bit different to keep learning and to have their needs met at their level, right? And so russellcoaching.com, our phone number is 212-716-1161. And I guess in closing, if you'll allow me, I just want to say your 2E kid is going to have moments where they seem very much like an adult, and it's okay to let them be in that space. And then they're going to have moments where they're very much like a kid. And I think the most helpful takeaway for parents is create space for both.
I can't end it there. And to ask to the listeners, do you see your kid being very adult-like, and then the next day or next minute, they're now a child? Let me know. I'd like to hear what your experience is with 2E, or if you got any more questions, email me at André@theimpulsivethinker.com. I'd really love to hear from you. Thanks again, Norrine. And to you, the listeners, thanks for learning with me. Take care.